Economic decline is often described as failure. In reality, it is usually a mismatch between systems and constraints. Nations do not simply lose capacity, they lose flexibility. What follows is not collapse, but stalling, a long period where effort continues, but outcomes narrow. This is the condition that defines modern Italy. For decades after the Second World War, Italy's economy was structured around industrial adaptation. It did not compete through scale alone, nor through cheap labor. It competed through responsiveness. A dense network of small and medium manufacturers adjusted prices, wages, and output in response to external pressure. This was not ideological, it was mechanical. The system absorbed shocks by redistributing cost internally. The national currency was central to this arrangement. Periodic devaluation was not a sign of weakness, it was a release valve. When productivity lagged or external demand softened, prices adjusted outward rather than inward. Firms stayed alive. Employment remained viable. Competitiveness was preserved not by austerity, but by flexibility. This mechanism masked structural differences inside Europe. Labor costs diverged. Productivity paths separated. Export profiles specialized. These differences did not prevent integration because adjustment was continuous. Exchange rates moved. Imbalances reset. The system bent, but it did not break. Monetary union changed that geometry. Exchange rate flexibility disappeared. What had once adjusted externally was forced inward. Costs could no longer be diluted through price movement. They had to be absorbed directly by firms, workers, and the state. This was not a political decision in daily practice. It was a mathematical constraint. At the same time, capital flows reversed their function. Under national currency regimes, capital compensated weakness. Under a shared currency, capital rewarded efficiency. Investment concentrated where productivity was already high. Regions that needed adjustment most faced the tightest conditions. This was not punishment. It was incentive logic operating without correction. Midway through this explanation, pause briefly. If you find value in examining economic outcomes through structure rather than accusation, consider subscribing and leaving a short comment. Not to assign blame, but to signal that this way of reading history remains useful. The impact on Italian industry was gradual but cumulative. Firms that had survived for generations on thin margins found themselves priced out of export markets. Wage compression replaced devaluation. Investment slowed. Scale became a requirement rather than an option. Many enterprises did not fail loudly. They stopped expanding. Then they stopped hiring. Eventually, they stopped existing. Productivity statistics began to flatten. Not because skills disappeared, but because the system penalized adjustment. Innovation requires slack. A currency that cannot move demands internal deflation instead. That process consumes time, confidence, and demographic stability. Young workers leave first. Capital follows. The narrative that emerged blamed culture and governance. These explanations are incomplete. Corruption did not suddenly appear. Political fragmentation was not new. What changed was the environment those factors operated in. Under flexible conditions, inefficiency could be diluted. Under fixed constraints, it compounded. The shared currency did not destroy industry by design. It removed a tool without replacing its function. Monetary policy centralized. Fiscal policy remained national. The result was asymmetry. States retained responsibility without control. Adjustment became slower, more painful, and politically opaque. This is the foundation of the modern Italian stagnation, not a single decision, not a single year, a structural shift in how cost is absorbed and where endurance is rewarded. The system did not collapse. It hardened. This first section establishes the frame. Industry did not disappear because Italy failed. It weakened because the mechanisms that once sustained it were no longer available. What replaced them was discipline without elasticity, stability without growth. Once flexibility was removed, divergence did not stop. It accelerated. Shared monetary space assumed convergence through discipline, but discipline without symmetry produces hierarchy. Regions with higher productivity and wage restraint accumulated advantage. Regions with legacy industries and higher labor intensity absorbed pressure. The gap widened quietly, through accounting rather than confrontation. The critical variable was cost. In a closed currency system, rising costs can be offset by exchange rate movement. In a shared system, costs are internalized. Firms must compress wages, reduce investment, or exit markets. States must choose between austerity and debt. Neither option restores competitiveness quickly. Both consume time. This asymmetry reshaped trade balances. Surplus regions expanded exports within the Union. Deficit regions imported capital goods they could no longer produce competitively. The currency did not adjust to reflect these imbalances. Instead, financial claims accumulated. What had once been corrected by price movement was now stored as debt. Here, money reveals its infrastructural role. Payment systems inside the Union ensured settlement regardless of imbalance. Trade continued, goods moved, capital circulated, but the adjustment was deferred, not resolved. Financial balances replaced currency adjustment as the shock absorber. The system absorbed cost by extending it across time. This mechanism appeared neutral, it was automatic, but neutrality at the system level can produce inequality at the regional level. Endurance favored those already aligned with the system's incentives. Others adapted by shrinking. Industry consolidated elsewhere. Supply chains reoriented. Skills followed capital. For Italy, the effect was cumulative. Manufacturing did not vanish overnight. It lost momentum. Investment declined relative to peers. Productivity gains slowed not because innovation ceased, but because margins disappeared. Firms without scale could not finance transition. Those that survived did so by narrowing ambition. Labor markets adjusted internally. Wages stagnated. Precarity increased. Domestic demand weakened. This fed back into industrial decline. A system designed for price stability inadvertently suppressed growth where adjustment required expansion, not contraction. Public finance filled the gap. Debt rose as private investment fell. This was not profligacy, it was substitution. The state compensated for missing private demand. But without monetary flexibility, fiscal expansion triggered constraint. Borrowing costs reflected market perception rather than productive need. Discipline tightened where stimulus was required. The result was a trap. Competitiveness required investment. Investment required growth. Growth required flexibility. None were fully available. The system did not fail. It stabilized at a lower equilibrium. Migration became the silent indicator. Young workers exited not because opportunity vanished everywhere, but because it concentrated elsewhere. This was rational behavior under unequal incentives. Human capital flowed toward return. The country lost not only output, but future optionality. It is tempting to assign blame here. But systems rarely collapse due to intent. They degrade through design limitations. A shared currency without shared fiscal capacity creates persistent imbalance. Adjustment occurs through internal deflation rather than external movement. This preserves the system while hollowing parts of it. This is the deeper cost. Not unemployment alone, but lost time, lost experimentation, lost generational continuity. Industry is not just machinery, it is accumulated skill. Once interrupted, it is slow to rebuild. This second section clarifies the mechanism. Italy did not lose industry because it refused discipline. It absorbed discipline without compensation. The system rewarded endurance where alignment existed and imposed patience where it did not. Money continued to flow, but growth did not follow evenly. Over time, the system settled into what appeared to be stability. Prices stopped moving sharply. Currency risk vanished. Financial integration deepened. From the outside, this looked like success. Inside, however, the cost of that stability accumulated quietly, distributed unevenly across sectors, regions, and generations. What replaced industrial dynamism was administrative endurance. Firms learned to survive without expanding. Banks learned to manage exposure rather than finance growth. The state learned to arbitrate scarcity rather than enable transformation. None of these adaptations were irrational. They were responses to constraint. Systems evolved to absorb cost, not to eliminate it. The shared currency achieved its primary objective, preventing monetary disorder, but it did so by freezing adjustment in place. In the absence of exchange rate movement, imbalance expressed itself through stagnation. Output plateaued, productivity drifted. The economy did not contract violently. It thinned. This thinning had structural consequences. Supply chains shortened. Risk tolerance declined. Innovation shifted toward incremental improvement rather than structural change. Long-term investment became difficult to justify when demand was uncertain and margins compressed. Industry requires confidence in future scale. Without it, preservation replaces ambition. The financial system adapted accordingly. Credit favored low-risk borrowers. Capital sought environments already aligned with the currency's incentives. Regions that needed expansion faced higher hurdles. This was not exclusion by intent. It was filtration by design. Money, as infrastructure, flowed where friction was lowest. Public discourse often focused on debt and discipline. These concepts framed the outcome as behavioral rather than mechanical. Yet discipline without adjustment capacity produces delay, not reform. Debt without growth becomes persistent. The system did not correct imbalance. It managed it. This management created permanence. What began as a transitional phase hardened into expectation. A generation entered the labor market without exposure to growth. Skills depreciated. Emigration became normalized. The loss was not only economic, it was temporal. Time, once lost, does not compound. Crucially, exit became structurally constrained. Financial integration tied payment systems, savings, and contracts to the shared currency. Leaving would impose immediate concentrated costs on households and institutions. Remaining imposed slow, distributed costs on productivity and demographics. The system favored endurance over disruption. This is how economic traps persist, not through force, but through asymmetry of cost. Change becomes expensive upfront. Continuity becomes expensive over time. Institutions choose what they are built to choose: survivability. The system does not ask whether this outcome is optimal. It asks whether it is manageable. The phrase "industry died" suggests a moment. In reality, industry receded. It lost centrality. It became one sector among others rather than the engine of growth. Services expanded, but without the export capacity to replace manufacturing's role. The economy remained functional, but less generative. History does not record this as a collapse, because collapse is visible. This was absorption. The costs of misalignment were spread across years, across households, across opportunity. The system continued to operate. That is precisely the problem. What this story reveals is not the failure of a country, but the consequence of a structure. A monetary system without internal flexibility will always privilege alignment over adaptation. It will reward endurance where compatibility exists and impose patience where it does not. Money is infrastructure. When its design changes, everything built upon it must adjust. Some structures are reinforced. Others are slowly starved of load-bearing capacity. History explains the present without blaming it. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look. You can change this.